Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachel Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
Well, undoubtedly, for most families, Thanksgiving is a season of delight, a coming back home, a large, sumptuous, delectable meal. So, of course, what would the Allender Center do as we invite you into your Thanksgiving feast, but to talk about food insecurity? Doesn't that feel...
We're just your resident trauma-informed folks trying to make sure there's space at the table for a lot of the things that will go unnamed and unaddressed, but no less at the table.
Yes. So we are going to talk about the glory of food, but given that there is glory, truly God-given glory to food, it shouldn't surprise anyone that there is a war with, at times against, the reality of the pleasure, the delight, the honor of being able to eat and to eat well with others. So that's what we want to reflect on, and we could not have a better guest on than what we would refer to as our resident nutritionist, Diane Summers. And Diane, you've been on before, but again, for the audience, you are a professional nutritionist, but you're also essentially a remarkable therapist who works in the intersection of the human heart and soul and the complexities that occur with regard to food. Is that a good beginning introduction? What would you want to add for folks?
Yes, that's great. My specialty is working with folks who come from a background of a war with food in their bodies and movement, and injuries that have occurred at the micro and the macro level. So all the way down to family of origin to the broader culture, and to help them return to peace and freedom and joy in their dynamic with food. It's an awesome job. I can't believe I get to do it.
Well, it is such an important category that I think we have, again, had you on a number of times, and each time it stirs so much for people. So as we step into this category of food insecurity, where does the words food insecurity take you? What would you want us to be thinking about with regard to that?
Well, I think, to first start with the fact that food insecurity can have a lot of different forms. Certainly, lack of access to food is going to create food insecurity, whether it's financial or it's part of an abusive structure. Just pure lack of access to being able to satiate one's appetite is food insecurity. But also looking at the broader culture, we live in a culture that is saturated and idealizes dieting and fighting one's bodies. And that creates food insecurity when there's a sense of I can't or I shouldn't eat certain foods, and can literally invoke a similar panic to that which would be found when food is not accessible.
So, so as we're dealing with food insecurity, the term generally is used for talking about people who do not have food. So they're without food. And it is such an important category that just can't be leisurely ignored. I mean, 1 out of 8 families suffers significant food insecurity. And you can look at this from the standpoint that communities often have collective struggles with that. The African American community has a 22.4% struggle with food insecurity, not having access financially or often geographic access to food. The Latino community, 20.8%. So there are communities. We know that rural communities suffer more food insecurity, even regionally. The southern portion of our country suffers more than, for example, the West or the Northeast. So these are not matters that we can just ignore because we may not have the same issue. But I think a lot of families, in terms of inflation, in terms of the rising cost of access to good food, oftentimes goes without or chooses food that has a degree of satisfaction, but not actually nutrition. So these are wars that really relate in the broader sense to the category of poverty, which we probably won't move much into, but it's a really important reflection on, how is it that we have many people who are suffering without food? But you're also bringing the category that even those who have adequate food can be in a war with food. So we're talking about food insecurity in both frameworks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do appreciate that you're naming like our privilege in this meeting room of currently having access to food, and that is not the case. And it, across the board for all peoples, it's always heartbreaking to hear when folks are having to make a decision between getting their medication or buying groceries. It should not be that way.
No, not in any way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's just something I want to make sure, at least as we move between these worlds, is just because I know some people can hear even a word like poverty and move toward like, well, shame on them for being poor or shame on them for not finding a way to. And I want to make sure we just hold the horror that we live in a country filled with abundance and that there are many systems in place, racialized systems, political systems, capitalist systems that actually perpetuate poverty and make sure certain people stay in poverty and don't have access. And so that, those are some complex systems. And I know, Dan, that's what you're meaning when you say that. I just wanted to like make sure I emphasize that for those of us who maybe grew up being told, people that struggle with poverty, even though some of us have stories of struggling with poverty and know something of food insecurity. It's just that reality that it shouldn't be. So I just wanted to reemphasize that, as you both said, it shouldn't be that way.
A good beginning source for engaging that is a book called Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond. I'm not fully through the book yet, but I am deeply impressed. He is the award-winning author of the book Evicted, which looked at how we arrange living situations to create, in some sense, a so-called underclass that really is kept in that position because nobody wants the jobs that so often get dispensed, that there really is not just an accident or not just a moral failure, but an actual structural systemic intentionality to keep certain people poorer and therefore dependent and therefore able to only take jobs that do not provide the kind of resources that are available in this country. So yeah, I think you're underscoring, Rachel, a very important asterisk that we will not step much into,
right,
but at least to underscore, poverty isn't accidental, and it's certainly not a moral failure, but we have to look at the larger systemic whole. But even as we address that,
right,
we're naming that you have known some food insecurity, Rachel, and I would say the same would be true for me.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Sorry. Yes. Let me affirm that. And I think in many ways, the other thing I would say is it can be very tempting, and we see this a lot in our trauma work. I know all three of us working with people, that it can almost be like, well, because I haven't known food insecurity of really knowing what it is to go without food, then what right do I have to like seek help for other forms of food insecurity? And so I also want to say that's not helpful. And we're here today to have a really important conversation around the war that we have in our culture and in our families and in our own bodies. And so I hope people will do the good work of holding like two things can be true at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. So take us, Diane, into where you see professionally, and yet even in your friendships and even in the Allender Center, where you have seen the reality of food insecurity.
Well, in terms of our broader culture and the ways that there are pressures to alter and change our bodies, I mean, that is pushing people constantly to dieting processes. And the thing with being raised in a home with a parent or guardian or both who are fighting their bodies is that kids are very perceptive and they watch and pick up on everything. And so even if parents who are at war with their bodies and therefore maybe limiting their food intake or engaged in a dieting process are not putting that on their children, children see it and hear it and watch it and are absorbing those structures. And it's so important in this to just hold like tenderness, right, towards the dieting parents, because we do what we do until we know something different. And it's such a predominant cultural structure it's almost like expected. You should be always trying to change your body. And the larger of a body you're in, the more you should be trying. It's really a horrific structure. And so when parents are engaging in these processes, just holding that with a ton of understanding and tenderness of this is what they know and oftentimes has been enforced within the medical community with a lot of fear added onto it. If you don't do this, you will get cancer, you will die. I mean, just so much fear mongering around weight and size that can make people literally terrified to not engage in a dieting process. And little minds and bodies are, of course, going to absorb that. And then I certainly see it, all the way to the other end of the spectrum where withholding food or literally giving children the contents of the trash can, like that, these are actually really exquisite and horrific forms of abuse too. So they're, withholding something that is a basic need, such as food, can be within some family systems that are quite sadistic, can be, certainly forms of trauma and abuse. So, and then the whole spectrum in between, for sure.
Well, Rachel, how would you put words to your own sense of food insecurity?
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking in the bouncing between the two, because on one hand, I could say, we always had food. There wasn't a sense of like my parents, were able to provide us food, and we were a part of a church community and larger communities where that kind of scarcity was not my experience. I don't think we were always getting the most nutritious food, but it was also the 80s. So just lots of sugar and, lots of junk food and different things. What's interesting is in both ways, as I became an adult and went to graduate school and did not have access to a lot of resourcing and didn't have credit cards for a certain season and had a lot of pride around not wanting people to know. I had not wanting my parents to know, like, having weeks where I have $10 until I get paid and I've got to make that stretch and I don't really know how to cook. So I have some very visceral experiences of what it is to be going without and not having the wherewithal of even knowing the system enough to know ways I probably could have gotten access to food if I needed it. So I had that on one hand. And, you know, as far as being in my body in this world, I have been, you know, I was a long distance runner. And if anything, I was one of those kids who was eating so many calories just to try to not have my muscles being eaten. So I would say, fortunate in some weird way that I was not growing up in a place of like I was worrying more, am I getting enough calories? Do people think I have an eating disorder because I'm very skinny, because I'm running competitively in long distance forms? However, when I got married and became a stepmom, I have had to deal with, and you know, Diane, I would say, maybe you can help me understand more of this. Like, I am one of those, and I'm married into a collectivist culture, a Taiwanese culture where like food sharing and family dining is like a thing. And I am very much finding I have a lot of food insecurity that shows up, like there's not going to be enough for me, and feeling very like, that's mine, you know, like that's my food, or like leave enough for me. Like I have a lot of panic around like, is there going to be enough food for me? And so I've been doing some work of like, where did this come from? And what is this connected to? And like, your family also, like they make sure everyone has enough food. That's like part of how it functions. So like, and so, yeah, I have a lot of questions there. Like where that's arisen from. And then of course now as I'm aging, and you know, I maybe would say like other places I've known something of food insecurity is I had a lot of autoimmune disorders that came in my early 30s, where my thyroid, you know, I had hypothyroidism that had gone undiagnosed for a long season, and I had small intestine bacterial overgrowth, probably from eating all the sugar I did when I was a kid and all the antibiotics I had and all the trauma, just like the things that would disorder your gut. And so I went through a season where like the ways in which that was being addressed was a lot of very particular, what's the right word? Like food diet, like all this restricted diets, like foods you can't have. And that genuine feeling like, if I eat that, it's going to make me sick, and it's going to be part of what's causing me to lose hair and have really bad acne and feel so terrible and feel fatigued. And in some ways, I had to do a lot of work to reorder and restore my gut health. And I'm grateful I had good care providers who knew that the movement and the where we needed to go was to get my bacteria and everything realigned so that I could take in the nourishment I'm meant for and enjoy a good relationship with food. And were helping me put words to like this terror you're experiencing around food. But it was real. And I had a long season where I couldn't eat most of the things that were at a common table. And so even the social isolation and grief of I'm having a different experience with food than like everyone else at the table. And I know that can be very real. Like there can be very real health concerns. And I would love to hear your thoughts, Diane, as a nutritionist, on like how you approach those stories with people where they're really trying to help their bodies. But in some of the ways that's being done, it can really lead to a scary relationship with food and a very utilitarian relationship with food. That brings like a lot of depression and anxiety. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Because food is it's so integral to life and our relationships and our experiences multiple times a day. So it makes a lot of sense that when you're prescribed, you know, really specific or limited diet to try to treat a condition, as well meaning as it may be, you know, and we probably won't get into like the efficacy of that or not, but more of just like the impact that it has on you, that for a period of time you were very limited and had that sense of, if I have something that's off plan, in essence, I could be harming myself, which is really terrified, right? Because the thing you wanted most was to feel better. And so to feel like you could kind of have a misstep and had to follow something that limited what you could eat, that in and of itself creates food insecurity for sure. And that on top of certainly having had the experience of having to stretch $10 over a week. I don't know for sure, Rachel, because I wasn't in your body at the time, but I imagine there were a lot of times that you really felt your hunger.
Yeah. Oh, certainly. Or like, when I'm like, okay, I can go to Taco Bell. And I almost feel it's like very vulnerable to share this because again, I actually think if there had not been such a stigma about needing to be a part of community and sometimes needing help, I probably would have had a very different experience. But because I didn't want my parents to think I wasn't being responsible and making bad decisions, and I didn't want, I had a lot of humiliation and shame around it. But yeah, I would like go to Taco Bell and be like, okay, I'm going to spend $1 on a bean burrito, and that will get me through this half of the day. But like, if you've ever eaten a bean burrito from Taco Bell, you know that it also does a number on your body. So, it was like, how do you be frugal, but also get some nourishment and nutrients? So it's all there together.
Yeah. You were being really resourceful, actually.
Hugely.
Yeah.
And again, do you not find, Diane, that most of us have some degree of war with food? Do you find that to be a common ailment? Or do you think it's somewhat unique?
I mean, it's the water we swim in. It's the air we breathe. All you have to do is walk through a checkout stand in the grocery store and see some sort of messaging on a magazine, and it can threaten your security with food. The belief of my body should look like that can literally trigger somebody to walk out and want to binge because the threat of a pending diet to change their bodies. And so, yes, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. And Rachel, one of the things that you're naming, right, is this, the piece of, I appreciate that you're bringing up kind of like having to utilize Taco Bell. And what happens with this, right, is like when resources are low, fed is best, right? We just want someone to be fed. And then you add on all the food judgments in our culture of, oh, you shouldn't eat sugar, you shouldn't have Taco Bell. And that heaps on the shame then when somebody is working so hard to just feed their bodies to then feel like they're doing it wrong. And so that good food, bad food mentality just exacerbates maybe the shame that's already in place of, I don't have resources to, make myself a meal.
So shame and food you see to be deeply linked.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Because if we didn't have shame around Taco Bell, in our culture of a sense of, oh, that's not an okay food, then that experience of going to Taco Bell would have been less conflicted. It would have been like, yeah, figured out a way to get dinner in a buck, right? Yeah.
So how do you, again, the fact that for most of us, there is some intertwining of shame and food, beyond the diet culture, beyond the implications, why? I know it's such a basic question and also unanswerable, but I still want to put you in the bind. Why do we have so much shame over food?
Well, multiple reasons, but I mean, in the context of food insecurity, we're in the spine between my body has an appetite. My body has a need for food. It's very primal. And no matter what the source is of food insecurity, if there's an inability to meet that appetite, instead of, especially because we live in a very, like, and Rachel, you named this at the beginning, kind of, um, not everybody, but kind of this like pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. So if I'm not able to navigate that, it's my fault or it's my appetite that's wrong, versus it's the system that's wrong. It's the system that I'm stuck in, that's leading to lack of resources, or the diet culture system, versus, that's what's wrong, not our appetites, not our desires for food. If we think about this in a more benign category, I'll use this example a lot with clients around our need for air. So if, as a kid, I don't know if either of you ever did the game in the swimming pool where you held your breath underwater and see who could hold your breath the longest. And you're looking through your goggles at everybody, like, who's going to pop up first. And when you pop up out of the water, nobody takes just like this slow, gentle breath, like, right? You take this just, gasping breath, because that's actually a primal response to a lack of air. Well, it's a primal response to a lack of food or a lack of access to food, to want to inhale, because food is at the level of survival like air is. And, but we don't have shame around taking a gasp of air, but there's a lot of shame in our culture around feeling like, or actually just inhaling a large amount of food in response to not having had access to it.
Brilliant. I think that is so helpful. And at least in the world I grew up in, the refrigerator was often empty because my mother didn't cook. And she didn't eat much. I would say she was a very high functioning anorexic. And in that, the one who did prepare food, my father, prepared it only in certain seasons. And so there was a taste of such goodness when he would cook. When my mom cooked, if she cooked at all, it was really a ragged, wretched can opening, soft peas, burnt ham on one side, and often white uncooked on the other. In other words, it was moderately, if not extremely, nauseating. So when I knew that we were going to have, which we had often, Swanson TV dinners, it was like fabulous. It's awful, but at least it's better than whatever my mom would prepare. So evening meals bore the uncertainty of the food itself, then add, at least as I've told my story a number of times, the dinner table was my ground for performance. It was my task at the evening meal to create enough intrigue by my storytelling that my mom would not be enraged, my father would not be helpless. So dinners have not been exactly the environment in terms of both the food itself or the process by which we came to eat. And I think there are, just as I've had the privilege of working with a lot of people over a lot of years, but not within the primary frame of nutrition, food does not come up until we begin talking about the dinner table, the dining room table, and then the stories of, in some sense, it was a war zone for a lot of people. And so when you have the war zone over the particular food process, then it's like the stage. And that's how a lot of clients have put it. Like, the dinner table is the stage where the dramas of the family play out in a heightened degree of accentuation. Is that what you find, or is that just my own experience?
Well, I mean, the dinner table too is where most family members are at that experience, right? Whereas other meals and snacks not everyone is together. So the dinner table has a way of gathering people. And especially if there hasn't been contact throughout the rest of the day, it's where everything can come out. Absolutely. And I hear, in your story, just the lack of dependability of you kind of had no idea what you were going to show up to. It could be something really pleasant. It could be something that tasted really disgusting to you. There could be a sense of relief in the sense that it was Swanson's. And so there's, the thing with frozen meals is they're typically dependable. So even though it might not have tasted good to you, at least you kind of knew what you were going to get.
I knew the applesauce, where it was going to be, and
Yeah.
the peas weren't mushy, which was so true of canned peas, at least the ones that we devoured.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. You were holding so much going into the dinner time. The lack of consistency with food and how good it was going to taste or not would have been enough for a little kid to hold. But you add on top of that you also had to perform, and you didn't even know what your nourishment was going to be for the performance. That's so much
Yeah,
stress.
just even naming what you're naming is like, it just brings up, like, I don't want to talk about this. Like, let's go back to your food insecurity, Rachel.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Yeah.
Well, the reality that, again, these things do play out, and they can play out even over Thanksgiving. Like, Thanksgiving was the one meal that my father took 100% responsibility for. And it was staggering in terms of, like, I anticipated that meal like no other through the whole year, because there wasn't just one meal. It meant there were leftovers. And I find that leftovers were one of the great thrills because, as you put it well, Diane, there was at least the consistency. There would be something filling the refrigerator. It would be, even if we didn't have microwaves back in my day, there was still a way of warming it up and creating ongoing goodness. So one of the things that we're inviting you, as you listen, to at least begin to ponder is, what has food meant? Where has there been a war? How are certain meals set in a way in which it creates both a longing for, but also a remembrance of, oh, this was good. And what that brings as you come to your table for Thanksgiving. Indeed, it is one of the loveliest holidays because it in some sense culturally forms us, shapes us to be thinking about gratitude. And the notion that we have food is a basis of gratitude. But we're kind of pressing into, where has there been shame bound to food, bound to the meal or the dining room table, that, again, to be able to surface allows you at least to begin to go, wow, why is there such ambivalence about eating a big meal? And making either statements about how full you are, or to a point where I've had to address the reality that when a Thanksgiving meal came, I would often get ill afterwards because I ate vastly more than my body could truly hold because of that food insecurity. So when you're beginning to engage these, shall we say, these side dishes, the turkey or ham or whatever you would have as your primary protein, when you come to it beyond, oh, it smells good, it looks good, it tastes good, what are you bringing? And I think that's the question that we're inviting ourselves, and certainly you as an audience, to. Where does that take either of you?
Well, I kind of want to go back to you as a little boy. Because I love that you turned it to the broader kind of questions. But right, when we're sitting with these stories, we're sitting with our younger selves. And I don't know how there would have been any other response to food insecurity and having had such a lovely meal once a year, other than to, almost eat in a Last Supper experience. Because if it literally was an annual thing, this was the last time you were going to get this delicious food that your father made until 365 days later.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
just the thought of it's going to be a long time can literally spike our hunger hormones and suppress our hormones that create satiation. And so this isn't just a mental piece of I need to get it in now. This is a physiologically driven response to I won't have this meal again for 365 days.
So satiation, in some sense, is influenced by level of trauma.
Oh, for sure. And the amount of threat that there's been to sufficient access to and permission to consume the food.
And another way of putting that is our ability to read what our body really desires, what we really need and desire, is so affected by trauma that we either are, again, eating in a way that leads to some level of pain because of fear, or not eating because of fear. So the interplay of fear and shame really has a great influence over our ability to monitor in a way that literally knows how to listen well to what we want. And my sense is that a lot of the work you do is helping people re-engage desire without shame.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And to trust, because to eat far past fullness on Thanksgiving when you won't get a meal like that again for another 365 days, and you're an 8-year-old boy who can't create it yourself because you're barely tall enough to look over the stove. Like, yes, that eating past fullness and that even having followed you perhaps into adult experiences of exquisite meals, right? It's just so understandable. It's just so understandable. And so to be able to bless the appetite and to understand, like, that makes sense that I was following my body in that moment. And why do we have these foods once a year? I mean, it's just like they are all in the grocery store.
Yeah.
Like, why not have a monthly Thanksgiving meal? And I know that sounds kind of funny, but like these are the things that heal our stories. Is actually having experiences that swaddle the brain and the body with sufficiency. Oh, we're having Thanksgiving again in a couple weeks. We're going to just keep pumpkin pie available throughout the year. Like, these do not need to be just one time a year foods that for people who've had such harm in their relationship with food, that just perpetuates it, So the idea of how can we swaddle with sufficiency, particularly around the foods that were so limited in childhood, that can be so healing.
Well, I just have to confess, I'm blown away. That simple thought, at least I will say, is as new as a newborn baby. What? I don't know. It's anti-American, isn't it? To have more than, but the point is, actually is, it's a violation of a normative structure that we've come to actually think is inherently good. Like, I've just never had the thought, wait a minute, Thanksgiving could actually be a meal more regularly. And I think that's
Mhm.
where some of the movement for me in addressing this, in a large portion, Diane, just due to your gifting and the wisdom you have brought, like, to be able to say, I can go to that meal more so over the last number of years with grief, being able
Mhm.
to honor, oh, there's so much heartache for me as I
Yeah.
go to this meal. And I have better categories to know why that grief is there. But also, oh my gosh, this is a play day. But to have the further thought of, wait a minute, you can have a play day once a month, a Thanksgiving once a month. I'm going to invite my family to begin to consider that. I mean, is that like, Rachel, are you as stunned as I am?
Well, you know what it had me thinking about, because your language of like swaddled in sufficiency is such a stunning phrase. And it had me thinking about I mean, again, I'm fortunate to come from also an Italian culture, which is a very table oriented culture. A lot of life happens at the table. And where I'm laughing, Dan, is so it, and at least in my experience growing up, we did create, it wasn't the same foods as Thanksgiving, but we literally had a family gathering slash holiday experience for like every holiday. That was like a part of my
Wow.
dad, who was not a part of the Italian family. He married into it. Like, I need at least 2 holidays that like we get to do something different, because it would be like, I mean, just St. Patrick's Day, like even things that like we don't really celebrate culturally, it would be like we're all getting together to have some kind of collective meal, right? That's going to have like appetizers and then a meal and dessert. So that was a very common experience for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so two things I was thinking about is like how much our relationship with food is so meant to be also relationship with others.
Mm-hmm.
And when that's a part of the food insecurity. Um, So, like Evie, my daughter, I was paying attention to something in our early days of breastfeeding, because, the midwives and lactation consultants were like, babies, just biologically will know when they're full. And, their bodies, you watch them, like, because you're constantly like, are they getting enough? How long are they supposed to be breastfeeding? All the anxiety. And when they get full, their like little mouths quiver and they kind of take a deep breath, and like that's how you'll know when it's time to switch sides and different things. Well, Evelyn was going, they're like, around 10 to 15 minutes. She was going like 30, 40 minutes on each side, and I'm like, she's not getting enough. And finally we had to figure out she was actually over, like taking more than her little body needed, because there was so much comfort and soothing she was getting in the sucking, because babies also can't differentiate between sleeping and sucking. Like it's a very, eating and sleeping have very similar emotional experiences for them. And so I'm watching this little human being who is being swaddled in, like, what was the word you used? Swaddled in
Sufficiency.
sufficiency. Like she's being swaddled in sufficiency, and there's no part of her little brain or body that's like, and that's good, that's all I need, I'm good now, I'm gonna unplug. And I did kind of have to help her because she was also having really bad reflux, but we found the balance. But there was something, I was like, there's something here for me, like she's getting sufficient nutrients, and something about her very new little human body, because it's more is available, is like, and I'll take more, thank you, mother. And so I kind of started playing with that. Like, I think God was a little bit like, and I have more for you, like there's more sufficiency for you, like you don't have to just settle for like basic needs. So that's where my brain goes down with this, like, yeah, what does it mean to have feast days where you're eating foods that bring life and feel special, and that you haven't maybe always had access to, in the presence of people you want to be at the table with. And even if there's drama and human mess, because that will be there, you still would rather be at that table with them. So I'm going to play with that phrase, swaddled insufficiency. I feel really grateful, Diane, for you to bring that, because I do think it is how we create new neural pathways and how our hormones, calm down in the sense of like they get satiated and they feel like there's sufficiency and there can be a new relationship. But like thinking about Evie, like I think that's in some ways how we're made. We're made for abundance and to be swaddled in sufficiency. And it's heartbreaking that for so many of us, for a multitude of reasons that you've named, that's not our primary experience, especially with food.
Yeah.
So as we wish you truly a very nourishing, delectable, and life-giving Thanksgiving, we also invite you to the table of knowing that the gratitude that we offer to one another oftentimes needs to be returned to our own hearts, and to, in some sense, know that as we go to a good table, what does it mean for you to be nourishing? Can I honor the grief and the desperation, but also the fear of not having enough or eating too much, and to know that there really is a power and principality, a world of the unseen world that wants to ruin the notion of banqueting, of what it is that we feast in and with regard to the Lord's table and the coming Lord's table. So this Thanksgiving, don't pretend. Let your body honor, and may there be, even in the midst of that, sweetness and joy. So happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks for listening to the Allender Center podcast. If you're gaining new insights through the topics we're covering in this podcast, we invite you to deepen your understanding of your story by working through one of the self-paced online courses offered by the Allender Center. If you'd like to engage your personal story and explore how the goodness and pain in your life has shaped you, we recommend starting with To Be Told, the online course led by Dr. Dan Allender. You can enroll for To Be Told or any other online courses at theallendercenter.org/online-courses. Oh, and one more thing. When you subscribe to our newsletter, you'll be the first to know about new offerings, events, and sales. Visit theallendercenter.org/subscribe to join our mailing list today. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you back here next time. The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.